And Mr. V is back again to annoy you and bore you to tears with another historical PowerPoint. This one's going to be on the Cold War. And of course, Billy Joel's song We Didn't Start the Fire is the easiest way to kick this one off. From 1945 to 1989-90, the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics decided to have a showdown. Now, it's called the Cold War because no actual warfare took place between those two nations, but we competed with them in every other aspect of politics, economy, and, of course, societal values. Across the board, it shaped our policies, it defined the time period, and it influenced our generations of Americans in the post-World War II world. And of course, this was the showdown between the two superpowers. The following is a rundown of what the United States and the USSR did during this early time period to establish their sides, their expectations, and more importantly, their goals in the post-war world. The 1950s society would be impacted by post-World War II economic issues. There, of course, was the economic insecurity of the 1930s and the Great Depression. And of course, there was always the question of would the Depression return after World War II's conclusion, as the total war economy was completely dependent upon government contracts and constant flow of supplies and resources to the front. And organized labor, of course, during World War II had decided not to strike or impact in any way America's ability to prosecute the war. Surprisingly to everyone, after World War II, the economic boom time that occurred was a continuation of that total war society. Of course, the returning soldiers came back and immediately started families. This is, of course, in the process of taking lives for the previous 4 years. Many were very, very interested in going home, and an entire generation of young Americans got married, had children, and moved to what eventually becomes known as the suburbs. The baby boom happens from 1946 to 1954, and it is the largest still to this day United States population, or generation, if you will. And of course, the terminology nowadays of okay boomer is in response to the fact that many of them are starting to retire and go on to government assistance. And of course, these baby boom generations, generational kids are going to grow up with new technology. Television is in its earliest stages. Air conditioning is making the Sun Belt, which is basically the southern states of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and then extending out to the west in New Mexico and Arizona, even Nevada, these states that usually are so hot that they can't possibly live there without some relief. Well, air conditioning provides that, and the Sun Belt grows in population and still has been growing in population since then. The GI Bill sends soldiers to college to get college degrees after they return, and many of them, of course, get low-cost houses, which prompts the suburban movement and sprawl of the 1950s. The Cold War, many historians believe, started at a place called Yalta. The Yalta Conference was the final meeting between the big three. Churchill, pictured to the far left and seated, FDR in the middle, and Stalin to the far right, were the big three during World War II, and this was the last face-to-face meeting between all three of those leaders before Churchill lost re-election in Great Britain as Prime Minister, and FDR eventually died in April of 1945. At this meeting, they planned out the post-World War II world. Stalin, of course, was ardent that any land that was taken from the Germans would be under at least Soviet occupation and control. The other two leaders, Churchill and FDR, were adamant that the people, regardless of where they were in Europe, would be free to have their own self-determination. The results of this were that the occupying forces of the Soviet Union and the Allied powers of England and the United States were going to have very distinct and different goals in what they wanted to accomplish. The British, the Americans, and the French would push for this idea that the people of those countries would have self-determination in both their government and their economies. Not surprisingly, those Western parts of Europe that were given their freedom after World War II most chose a democratically elected government and capitalism with a minor tinge of socialism here and there as their methodologies moving forward. But the Eastern European countries under the Soviet bloc would go the opposite direction. They would be under the Soviet sphere of influence and choose a communist form of economy with an authoritarian form of government that usually was a puppet government of the Soviet Union. The main problem from Yalta was the decision to split up Germany into 4 zones of occupation. The United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union would all take a quarter of Germany and put it under their influence. Not surprisingly, the Soviets were on the eastern side of things, and East Germany sprouted up with a puppet government and regime underneath Soviet control. The other 3 zones fused into what eventually became known as West Germany. The major problem was in Berlin, and we'll talk about Berlin later. As we discussed in the World War II PowerPoint, Harry S. Truman had become President of the United States after the death of FDR in April of 1945. Unlike FDR, Truman was not a master of the media. He was not fit to be President of the United States when it came to classic definitions of what a president should and could look like. He was a simple man from Missouri who had very little education, as he is the only 20th century president never to go to college. He had served during World War I, but had not received huge commendations for his service, even though it was considered to be a quality service in the military. He had returned back to Missouri after the war, finally marrying the woman that he had been pursuing for years, Bess Truman, and immediately set off on a long string of failed business opportunities. The old joke about Truman is that he was a failure in life and in business all the way up to the presidency. What he did do well is he was very good at being an elected official. He served the public and he served them well. Now, he was also a member of a political machine in Missouri, which dogged him all the way through his days as an elected official. But looking at his track record, he did not seem that he was influenced in large ways by that political machine. Truman cut his teeth in the Senate as a senator from Missouri, and he worked his way into the good graces of the Democratic Party by being somebody that stood for principled leadership, sound economic policies, and honest policies during wartime. He was placed in as VP candidate to satisfy the needs of people who felt that the Democratic Party needed a solid leader and someone that was just dependable. At no point did they expect him to be President of the United States, but from the time he took over, this simple man was going to be the most powerful man in the world as the Cold War began. So why was there a conflict between the US and the USSR? It's not just as simple as communism versus capitalism as your textbook may paint. Yes, there was a distinct difference between communism, where the tools of production and goods and services are all controlled by the government, and in capitalism, where there's a free market approach. That certainly is a big crux of why there was a distinct difference between these two nations. But again, it was too complex for just that simplistic of a moniker. In 1933, the United States finally recognized the government of the Soviet Union. But this, of course, happened after years of strife within the Soviet Union, and it certainly happened way too late to satisfy Joseph Stalin. The United States had gotten involved in the Soviet Revolution, not officially, but we had. Even Wilson had committed some troops to the eastern slopes of the Soviet Union to try and influence the whites versus the reds back during the revolutionary time period. So Stalin certainly had his reservations about the United States and its inability to really back up his regime. Of course, there was a delay in action on the Eastern Front when Germany invaded. Now, part of that was because of Stalin's non-aggression pact that he had signed with Hitler, and there wasn't too much sympathy for him that he had been stabbed in the back by Hitler. But of course, our inaction and our slow response to this drove a wedge between Stalin and the United States presidents, whether it be Roosevelt or Truman, because of our inaction at that time. Of course, our atomic secrets from the Manhattan Project, that even though we were allies with Churchill and Stalin, that we had only really told Churchill about it and not Stalin, that we have kept him out of the loop, if you will, of this massively explosive and destructive weapon, certainly drove another wedge between the leaders and allowed for a level of distrust. The Lend-Lease aid that we had given to the British, we quote-unquote offered it to the Soviets, but we couldn't get it to them because of the absence of a warm water port, which, by the way, was the reason that Stalingrad was so important and vital. Stalin had some gripes, and they were legitimate in that, but the United States also had at least some fair amount of justification for not supplying weapons and aid to the Soviet Union. Of course, the reconstruction loans that we offered after World War II under the Marshall Plan were going to predominantly Western democracies. Even though we offered it up to him, Stalin realized he couldn't take money from us while still bad-mouthing our policies and our principles. And of course, the Soviet Union never quite gave the United States a pass for being isolationist during the 1930s and coming late to the party of World War II, and only because of the forced actions of the Japanese. In the post-World War II world, the United Nations became the new way of going about global diplomacy. It was a peacekeeping body that was formed specifically to allow all member nations, and it was any nation that wanted a seat at the table, to participate in global diplomacy, peacekeeping, and for the most part, trying to make sure that any cause that had brought about World War I or World War II would be solved. This, of course, was kind of the culmination of everything that Woodrow Wilson wanted way back in 1918 with his 14 points. The main crux of the United Nations was the Security Council. The Security Council is a council of 11 member countries. 5 of them are permanent. The United States, Great Britain, France, China, and the Soviet Union were the 5 permanent members and still are to this day. The other 6 votes of the Security Council are on a rotating basis of the 6 continents, and every nation gets a 2-year term, if you will, to serve on the Security Council on a rotating basis. Now, the Security Council, of course, hears any war or gripe between nations, if you will, and the Security Council decides whether or not to put in peacekeeping forces. Now, the one caveat to all this is it's not a majority vote. If a member nation who is on a rotating basis votes no, they of course have a say, but they may get overruled by everybody else in the room. The only nations that cannot be overruled are the permanent members, meaning 10 nations could say we need to commit troops, but one of the Security Council, let's say China, says no, we're not going to do it. By a vote of 10-1, China can block it. They have what is known as veto power. And of course, The real big thing about this is, why is there such a big difference between the United Nations and the League? Well, the United Nations has been able to stand the course of time because of the membership of all nations. The League, of course, was selective and exclusionary for many. Now, the UN has had some successes. They have been able to end the Korean conflict early, and they've managed to get rid of some global conflicts before they even start. But there have been a massive amount of failures as well. Vietnam certainly comes to mind, and Afghanistan for both the Soviets and the United States as well. Of course, post-World War II, there were issues with what to do with Germany. Germany, of course, had the Nazi issue. There were Nazis that had survived World War II, and even though only 20% of the entire population had identified as a Nazi during World War II, there were still a number of people in Germany that had committed what are known as war crimes. In order to figure this out and straighten things out for the betterment of humanity, the Nuremberg trials were formed. Now, they were staged in Nuremberg, Germany, which was supposed to be the Nazi capital city. If you go to Nuremberg, you will see that they built their own version of the Colosseum from Rome. This was supposed to be the German Congress Hall of Nazis. They had built large parade grounds and places for zeppelins to basically anchor. They had all this set up to be a German Nazi capital. So ironically, the most ardent Nazis were paraded back into Nuremberg to stand trial. The most notable of this would have been Hermann Goering, who was considered Hitler's right-hand man. Hitler, of course, had committed suicide, so had Heinrich Himmler, but Goering was his right-hand man, his leader of the Luftwaffe and leader of most of the German military during the Second World War. Goering committed suicide while in captivity because of the obvious nature of his crimes. He was going to be held accountable. So instead of being paraded out and hanged by his captors, he basically committed suicide instead. Now, there were still other Nazis that did find the hangman's noose after, being convicted of their role in the Holocaust or their role in killing groups or POW massacres or whatever. But the Nuremberg trials certainly were a way of showing that there was going to be some justice from these humanitarian violations by the German military. Of course, we had talked about splitting up of the Deutschland. We had split up Germany into East and West quadrants, and the Eastern Bloc started to form. As Winston Churchill famously said in Missouri at the very beginning of the Cold War, an iron curtain had descended across the continent. And it was Stalin's view that he had to eliminate and squash any Western influence within the Eastern Bloc. He couldn't have part of Berlin being capitalist while the remainder around it was all communist. So he tried what was known as the Berlin Blockade, refusing to allow aid to come in and out of Berlin. Truman's response was the Berlin Airlift, where we flew massive amounts of planes across Berlin and dropped different resources and supplies within to make sure that Berlin was taken care of during this time period. And again, the whole idea was to keep Berlin a part of the Western democracies at all cost. It cost a tremendous amount of resources and money, but Truman felt it was necessary to do so, which laid the groundwork for what eventually became known as containment policy. Now, as I said before, containment policy was rooted in the idea that we would not allow, as a Western democracy, the continuation and spread of Soviet policies and sphere of influence. Basically, the United States had been seen as somewhat weak in our response to the Soviet Union at the tail end of World War II. Now, partially that was because of just the fatigue of war, if you will, that the Americans really didn't want to get involved in a conflict so soon after such a major world conflict. But bottom line is the Soviet Union seemingly had taken not just the Soviet republics of places like Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, but they had taken control and influenced the policies of not only East Germany, but Poland, of Bulgaria, of Romania, and a whole host of other nations. Truman's policy at this point was to stop it where it was, and containment policy was laid out in a speech that was later known as the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine is the idea that we were going to give money and resources to Greece and Turkey to promote their democracies and make sure that they didn't fall victim to any sort of communist infiltration or takeover. Part of what we got in return, though, was very controversial. Greece and Turkey both allowed us to have military bases, whether it be naval, whether it be Air Force, or both, within the confines of their country in response to our economic and political assistance. Now, of course, the Soviet Union did not like this. They certainly wanted to find a way to put a stop to it, because both Greece and Turkey would have been within range of our heavy bombers and eventually missiles. So during the Cold War, this was a strategic issue for the Soviet Union. And this is, by the way, what is going to lead in the early 1960s to the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I digress, we'll get there later. Another way that we felt a need to help out the Western democracies was the Marshall Plan. The entirety of Europe was decimated by World War II, whether it be the bombings of German cities, British cities, French cities, you name it. If you've seen any documentaries or films from World War II, you have seen countryside and city alike totally decimated and destroyed by war. And this is not just talking about the death that occurred in the millions across Europe, but also the loss of businesses, the loss of homes, farms, you name it. Now, of course, the USSR, as I said before earlier, they denied this help. But the Secretary of State George Marshall realized that after World War I, the real issue was the problem of a short-term economic boost without sustained growth. He realized that if we didn't help out those Western nations to recover economically, there was no way they were going to be able to recover politically. And so we gave money and resources through the Marshall Plan to help rebuild Europe. One of the final issues to solve during Truman's foreign policy blitz after World War II was what to do about Israel. Of course, Israel had not existed since biblical times, but the Israeli people felt that their homeland, which is currently in Palestine, needed to be restored. The British had taken over Palestine in the age of imperialism, and they had fought for it against the Germans during World War II. At the very tail end, because of the Zionist movement of the early 1900s, many Jewish people had already relocated to the Middle East, and of course there were a number of Jewish people that had survived the Holocaust that felt that they needed a land to be free and safe and out of the clutches of many of these countries that did not want the Jewish people, that were anti-Semitic in their own nature. And so the United States, along with their allies, helped with the creation of Israel in 1947. And of course, when Israel breaks away, they take a tremendous amount of territory and land for what is today Palestine as well. And that is what is at the root cause of the modern-day struggle between the Israelis and the Arabic people. And of course, we're talking about the Jewish against the Muslim in the Holy Land. All because of the end of World War II and the sympathies that the world community had towards the Jewish people after the Holocaust. Of course, all of this buildup to World War II had caused a tremendous amount of extra material and supplies for a war effort that was now done. So part of the transition was the National Security Act. The United States, which had now moved to the forefront of being a superpower on the global scale, started to reorganize exactly how they prosecuted war. Instead of having a Secretary of War and a War Department, The United States instead decided under the National Security Act to make a Department of Defense. That's why today we don't have a Secretary of War. We have a Secretary of Defense. It's still the same basic mentality, so the same basic job. We just retitled it and reformatted exactly what they do. They work in combination and basically hand in hand with the NSC, which is the National Security Council, and the CIA, which is the Central Intelligence Agency. These three work together to try and compile all the information we can have from diplomacy, from international agreements, from espionage circles, to try and understand exactly, at the time, of course, what the USSR was up to and their allies. The Selective Service System was in place during World War II, better known as the draft, to formulate our armed forces, to get our numbers up. And it was still used after the fact to try and keep peacetime forces well supplied and well stocked with new volunteers, and so we could get the old line guard out and back to regular life. Of course, during this time period too, we had to worry about the USSR and their global expansion. The easiest way we thought to do that was to formulate our own alliance called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In the map pictured there, the blue nations all participated within NATO, even up until this day, and it's grown from there. NATO, of course, was the idea of collective security, this idea that if the Soviet Union were to attack one of these nations, that they would be backed up by us and our allies. So, to be fair, if let's say the Soviet Union were to invade Germany, West Germany at the time, they would in actuality be invading the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the rest of those in blue. Not to be outdone, in the early 1950s, the Soviet Union also formed their own buffer zone of states under the Warsaw Pact. And of course, you can see in there East Germany, Poland, Hungary, what is today the Czech Republic and Slovakia, back then known as Czechoslovakia, along with Romania, Bulgaria, you name it. Those were the countries that were put into the Warsaw Pact. And this is where you get that terminology that you would have learned as a freshman, satellite nations. These buffer states that before we would ever get to the Soviet mainland, we would have to go through them to get to the Soviet Union. Both of these organizations, or these alliances as it were, form the basis of East versus West throughout the entirety of the Cold War. Now, of course, there were going to be problems in the Asian continent after the war. Once Japan withdraws and the imperial ambitions of the Japanese are defeated, the rest of the world is going to have to basically find a new normal. Now, it starts with the push towards democratizing Japan. After removing the emperor and many of his followers, war trials very similar to the Nuremberg trials took place due to the numerous war crimes involved in things like the Bataan Death March and other POW human rights violations, if you will, during World War II. In charge of all of it, like a bad penny, here he comes again, General Douglas MacArthur, who becomes the peacetime governor of Japan before we are able to turn it over to what eventually becomes a fairly solid democratic republic in Japan. MacArthur earns rave reviews for his handling of all the issues in Japan, and actually becomes a odds-on presidential candidate in 1948 and 1952, but never actually gets to that point because of the Korean conflict, but that's a story for another time. The Chinese also have their revolution kick into high gear. Jiang Xi, or Chiang Kai-shek, and Mao Zedong, who are pictured here, left and right, basically go right back into the pre-World War II civil conflict as to whether or not we were going to have nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek or communist forces under Mao. Mao ends up winning that conflict, and the United States earns a tremendous amount of criticism for not getting involved sooner in the conflict and trying to avoid the fall of the fall of the Chinese into communism. And of course, that criticism is leveled at Dean Acheson and Truman for their failure at good, solid diplomacy and, of course, the eventual containment policy. And of course, during this time period, as China starts to rise up, the United States becomes nuclear by 1952, after, of course, the Soviet Union finds out how to get their own atomic weapon. So what eventually becomes known as the arms race kicks into high gear in the late 40s, early 50s, as those two nations start to try and outgun and out-destroy each other. And of course, it does get to ridiculous lengths, as both nations would have the capability and the firepower to destroy the Earth multiple times over during the 1950s and 60s. During the early Cold War time period, one of the darker things to happen was the question of whether or not people were loyal Americans. This was very similar to the 1920s issue of the Red Scare, as loyalty to the United States, especially now that we were in direct confrontation and competition with the Soviets, was going to become a major concern. The loyalty program was the idea that Americans who had maybe spoken out against the war, Americans who had been too complimentary of the Soviet Union, or even on the opposite side, Nazi Germany or any of the Axis powers, needed to take a loyalty oath to the United States in order to assure that they would maintain either their government position or even their jobs out into the private sector as well. Looking into all of this outside influence was HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. They called people in front of Congress to question them, to find out, get to the bottom of the communist infiltration into our businesses, into our government programs, even into things like Hollywood. The Hollywood 10 were a group of directors, producers, and other Hollywood elites that were accused of having communist sympathies and ties, and in a sense were using their Hollywood movies to promote some form of social or communist programming to try and indoctrinate the American people. The Hollywood 10 refused to go in front of Congress, and because of that were held in contempt and served jail time. Alger Hiss was another person that became famous during this time period. He was a State Department official who was accused of having communist ties and even so much as working as a spy for the Russians. He had managed to dodge a number of different charges up throughout the early Cold War period, but Richard Nixon, a young congressman from California, came in who was in his own right a trained lawyer. He managed to get Alger Hiss through cross-examination to basically admit to communist ties. Alger Hiss was found to actually have ties to the Russian government, and that, of course, not only knocked him down a peg to where he had to resign and he was jailed for his associations, but it also brought into question whether or not we could trust people, even in the government, which was a very rough thing during the 1950s because it's going to grow into a much larger problem. And then, of course, not helping it, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, two people that were accused of selling atomic secrets to the Russians and were actually not only found guilty of treason against the United States, but sentenced to death and did die for their ties to the Russian government. Most likely they were indeed peddling atomic secrets to the Soviet government, and because of that, it spawned a new Red Scare of sorts within the United States. By 1948, Harry S. Truman had taken some pretty critical and controversial stances. Not only had he ended World War II with a very controversial decision to drop the atomic weapons on Japan, he had also done a number of things in the economy and in the military to draw some severe rebuke from people around the country. from desegregating the military through executive order, which drew ire from the Southerners, to proposing some New Deal legislation, kind of on steroids programming. Truman had rankled and ruffled some feathers all the way through, whether it be Republicans or Democrats. So in 1948, he was very much in danger of losing the presidency. Of course, going after him was the Republican nominee Thomas Dewey, who had lost to FDR in 1944, but had been a very successful governor of New York, and therefore was the odds-on favorite to be the President of the United States. Dewey's problem is that he was far too comfortable in his lead in the polls. He felt like really it was his election to lose, and all he had to do was sit back and wait for Truman to fold. Especially helping him was the fact that the Democrats were split. The Dixiecrats had split off from the Democrats. These were Southern Democrats who felt betrayed by Truman and the party because of their civil rights legislation and because of the desegregation of the nation's military. And then even more so, the former vice president under FDR, Henry A. Wallace, decided to defect from the Democrats as well and form the Progressive Party, which really, on the surface, was a communist party. Wallace was exceptionally liberal in his policies and darn near communist in his mentality. Again, as I said before on the World War II slideshow, he was kind of Bernie Sanders on steroids. Needless to say, with the Democrats split three ways, it sounded more and more like this was going to be an election of 1860 type scenario. If you remember, Lincoln ran as a Republican against a splintered Democratic Party that went three ways with Breckinridge, Bell, and Stephen A. Douglas. Instead, Truman rose above and somehow managed to win the Electoral College against Thomas Dewey. As you can see, of course, Harry S. Truman holding up the picture or the front page, if you will, of the Chicago Daily Tribune with the headline, "Dewey Defeats Truman." When the Chicago Tribune editors went to bed that night, they thought because of early election returns that Thomas Dewey was going to win the presidency. Instead, Harry S. Truman, in the biggest surprise in Electoral College politics, won the election. The results were certainly in favor of not only Truman, but the Democratic Party as well, and it furthered his motion that he would continue the policies of the New Deal and reframe it as what was known as the Fair Deal, and pushing for desegregation of not just the American military, but also other institutions as well. And while Truman did not get to go as far on civil rights as maybe he wanted to, and he certainly didn't get to go as far as he wanted to when it came to unemployment numbers or other societal ills, it was a definite surprise that he won and was able to continue on as president. Now, of course, Truman, as much as he's smiling here in 1948, he will not be as popular in 1952 because of international issues. Of course, one of the main reasons that Harry S. Truman was going to lose a lot of prestige and popular opinion was because of the Korean conflict. When South Korea is invaded by the North, it becomes painfully clear that the North is being aided and supplied by the Chinese government. And this, of course, is a direct challenge towards Truman's plan of containment policy, that you contain communism where it currently lives and you don't allow it to spread. Truman's reaction is to turn to the United Nations and utilize what becomes known as NSC 68. National Security Council Resolution 68 basically makes it very clear that they are going to utilize their military strength to help out the United Nations to, quote, keep the peace. NSC 68 basically says that the parallel that runs across the Korean Peninsula between the North and South will not deviate. The 68th parallel will be the dividing line between the North and the South. And so the United Nations votes in a resolution to go after the North Koreans. Placed in charge of that, again, Douglas MacArthur. Douglas MacArthur comes in as the leader of the United Nations forces and manages to press back the North Koreans so far that he pushes them into China. This, of course, would be an act of war if he were to attack them in China. But MacArthur not only says that he's willing to go after them in China, he's also pushing to use nuclear weapons, which infuriates not just Truman, but the world community. The world community definitely has a earful for MacArthur, and MacArthur refuses to listen to Truman, calling him all the names you can think of in the book. Truman counters with the idea that he can control MacArthur. MacArthur doesn't think it can happen, and sure enough, before you know it, Truman fires MacArthur as the leader of the United States forces. MacArthur then returns to the United States, goes in front of Congress, gives one of the most quoted speeches in American history, where he says, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away." Even so, after bloody years of conflict, the Korean conflict ends with that 68th parallel being the dividing line between the North and South, and it is the most guarded border in the world. Of course, the Korean conflict, the only thing people really remember, unfortunately, about it is the TV show it spawned, MASH, which is what this music is from. 1950s society, of course, saw tremendous strides towards really the modern society we have today. We became a massive consumer culture during this time period, where we started to buy not only the houses in the suburbs, but the furniture and the amenities that went along with it. And of course, consumer culture is no more evident than the rise of new businesses like McDonald's. McDonald's became the standard bearer of what fast food should look like, and pictured there is the founder, Ray Kroc, who pushed, and I know this is going to sound weird, pushed for good service in a quick fashion with cleanliness as the number one job. It's fallen off a little bit since then, but consumer culture spawned these new businesses and these new basically parts of our culture that have endured even up until this day. Television had a lot to do with that, with commercials, and of course the programming of the time period, very family oriented. The I Love Lucy's, the Leave It to Beavers of the time period really stressed family togetherness, family bonds, and working together. And of course, sports during the 1950s, baseball still very much an important part of the culture, but football and basketball started to make strides as well. Music, of course, people like Little Richard, Buddy Holly, Elvis Presley became household names during this time period as rock and roll started to make its mainstream approach. And of course, because of the shaking of Elvis's hips and other sexual innuendo out there, we are going to have this decade of sexual allure, which is going to spawn also a massive conservative movement against it. Critics are going to say that we're moving too fast and that our young people are growing up too fast. Sound familiar? Dwight David Eisenhower parlayed his World War II career as Supreme Allied Commander into being the President of the United States, the 34th one to be exact. In the election of 1952, the Republicans and the Democrats alike tried to recruit Ike, as he was known, to be the presidential candidate, because really Eisenhower had never had a political background. He had never served in a political office, and quite honestly, he had never really declared if he was Republican or Democrat. In the end, he declared Republican and ran for office against Adlai Stevenson, the governor of Illinois. He beat Stevenson not only in 1952, but also in 1956 as well. The main question in 1952 was whether or not the declared vice president for Ike was going to actually serve. The vice president was Richard Nixon. If you remember, Richard first came on the scene as a Republican congressman from California, and Nixon had fallen into a little bit of a scandal where he was accused of taking campaign funds illegally. He managed to save his political career, which was kind of a theme of Nixon throughout history, by going on the national news and presenting a speech known as the Checkers speech. In the speech, he basically said that he had not done what he was accused of doing, but he did take something that he felt he needed to come clean about. And he said it was a little Cocker Spaniel dog named Checkers, and that his daughter named the dog, and they're never giving it back. And of course, the American people listening at home, even if they liked him or not, said, "Aw, he's a daddy. He couldn't possibly be a crooked politician," and they let him stay. So Nixon became Ike's vice president. Now, under Eisenhower's first term, the Korean conflict finally came to its conclusion, and the armistice was declared. Now, the results of the Korean conflict were that we had a North and a South, but it really was more of a tie, and the Americans really didn't sit too nicely with that. We had not tied conflicts. We weren't used to that. So Korea definitely, unfortunately, has kind of almost taken the same stance as the War of 1812 or the Mexican War in American mindsets when it comes to warfare, because of that tie. We just don't think about the conflict as much. Even so, it was a very bloody conflict and laid the groundwork for the containment policy throughout the 1950s and 60s. Eisenhower's presidency can best be represented by his policies of the interstate highway system, which he passed through Congress in the 1950s, to link American cities using highways that he got the idea from Germany and the Autobahn system. He also had some minority issues during his presidency, thanks to the Little Rock Nine, which of course were the students that were supposed to be admitted to Little Rock High School, Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. He sent down federal troops to enforce that, and by doing so set a precedent that the federal government would get involved in civil rights matters, whether the states liked it or not. And of course, these are going to be issues moving forward, as the governors of these states felt like it was an overreach of federal authority. To bring it up to modern day terms, during this coronavirus response, there has been a question of, when is it Trump's decision or when is it DeWine's decision? Should the governor get the chance or the directive, if you will, of how to handle this, or should it be the president of the United States? Not to say it's the same situation, but it is very similar in its nature of, is it federal or is it state? Eisenhower felt that civil rights was a federal decision, and he called in the soldiers specifically to do it. And when I say soldiers, I mean the National Guard, to enforce this. This would, of course, lay the groundwork for what Kennedy would do, for what LBJ would do, for what Nixon would do in regards to civil rights. And of course, new foreign policy during this time period, John Foster Dulles as the Secretary of State is going to influence Eisenhower's decision-making and change and really kind of tweak the Truman Doctrine into what better becomes known as the Eisenhower Doctrine. The Eisenhower Doctrine during the 1950s is that we are going to use containment, but that we are going to use military advisors, we're going to use economic influencing, and that we're going to utilize different methodologies to enforce American policies and American programming overseas. Of course, one of the darkest parts of Eisenhower's reign as President of the United States was the rise of Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin. Joseph McCarthy was the junior senator, which means he was the less experienced senator from Wisconsin at the time. He had won his position in the Senate, but started to realize that his war record wasn't enough to keep him there. He hadn't done anything. So sure enough, in the early 1950s, as he was facing a pretty solid chance that he was not going to get reelected, he found a new way of basically solidifying his name, getting his name out into the press, and making himself a legit candidate to be in the United States Senate. And basically what he did in Wheeling, West Virginia, was he delivered a speech in which he accused government officials of conspiring against the United States government. He basically took what Alger Hiss was and amplified it to where it was this growing problem throughout the government. Now, of course, did he have any evidence of this? Absolutely not. And when the press would actually press him for newer, more updated information or some form of credible documentation for any of his charges, he would just write it off or say sensational things or give a different number or whatever else. When he held up a sheet of paper during that speech in Wheeling, West Virginia, he claimed he had over 200 names on the list. Now, it could have been his grocery list for all we know. But bottom line is, he accused people in the government of being conspirators with the Soviets to try and take down our American system. Now, in the very beginning, because of Alger Hiss, because of the House Un-American Activities Committee, because of this growing fear and almost Red Scare-like mentality against the Soviets and communist infiltration, he had the approval of most Americans because of this. So Joseph McCarthy absolutely pressed for more power, more ability to go after the communist infiltration and everything. And because of that, he eventually steps too far. Now, we know now that Joseph McCarthy was a functioning alcoholic. We know that he was drinking a fifth of Jack a day and just a miserable human being. And if you remember at the beginning of the year, I said there were, some top 5 Americans who I felt were just scummy individuals. And of course, we talked about Aaron Burr earlier in the year. Joseph McCarthy is my number 1. I think he's probably one of the worst Americans ever. Because he tears people down. If he named people, they got blacklisted, which meant they couldn't get a job. They couldn't really, there were legitimately people that got divorced because the wife couldn't stand to be with a known communist. There were people that committed suicide because he had been named, or there was some whiff that he had communist ties. So McCarthy not only ruined lives, he ended lives. Now, again, like I said, he went too far. He went after the American military, which is not a popular thing to do. And he challenged George Marshall. Now, Marshall, the author of the Marshall Plan, a high-ranking general, even higher ranking than Eisenhower during World War II, for that matter, when Marshall is challenged with his loyalty to the United States, it becomes very apparent that McCarthy is bullying him. And through the miracle of TV, the American people can see that McCarthy is barely hanging on, and whereas he is sweating and constantly repeating himself and really just looks like a confused man, Marshall looks composed. He looks like he absolutely is the American patriot that he is. And of course, a lot of Americans don't like hearing that the American military has communist infiltration, as many of their sons had gone off and fought and died during World War II for that American military. So McCarthy ends up losing support because of that and gradually loses everything. He dies broken, lonely of alcoholism and cirrhosis of the liver, as he probably should have. And there were other people tied to him as well that were less than credible people. There's a attorney by the name of Roy Cohn who kind of becomes his second in command. Cohn was somebody who was going after people claiming that homosexuals were communists and that they need to be rooted out, while he himself was a communist, and for that, not communist, sorry, while he himself was a homosexual. So this was a very confusing time period in American history, and one that needed to end. Dwight Eisenhower decided to run for re-election in 1956. He easily cruised to re-election over the same man he had beaten in 1952 as Adlai Stevenson attempted to unseat the very popular Eisenhower. And basically Eisenhower maintained control due to the fact that his policies were not viewed as being unbelievably controversial, nor were his statements. The main problem that he saw was that the Democrats controlled Congress. While he was not really 100% a Republican, a lot of his programs were considered to be somewhat conservative. And so when the Democrats took control, they tried to make sure that there was a balanced approach to the Cold War. And of course, because of that, there is some backlash at this time period on labor. Labor during this time period had started to ask for higher revenue as the economy had been very good in the early 1950s. It had started to fall off in the mid 1950s. And of course, when cutbacks were happening and wages were being, if not frozen, possibly even lowered, there were a ton of labor unions that started seeking out better pay, better benefits, and because of that, you're going to end up with some labor issues. And this is a typical theme that you've seen throughout this year. It's a back and forth between the owners of the factories and the labor. And it also helps to point out at this point, we start to see a change in the blue collar to more white collar mentality. Now, instead of having just factory work, we have businessmen, we have office buildings, and white-collar businesses started to sprout up in much larger quantities than ever before. Of course, the highlight of Eisenhower's second term was the advent of the space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the very first man-made artificial satellite. As it orbited the Earth, Americans panicked with this mentality that the Russians could spy on us, that they could see us. There were even people that ran outside to watch it go overhead because you could see the light of Sputnik as it crossed the nighttime sky, if you will. In reality, Sputnik was a terrible Polaroid camera that took grainy photos of the Earth from outer space, but it still prompted a backlash against the government, that somehow we were falling behind. And in that Cold War mentality, the United States government responded in 1958 by creating NASA and dumping a tremendous amount of money into math and science educational programming to make sure that we could raise the next generation of scientific Americans. And that was going to play a large role into the space race of the 1960s. As Eisenhower continued on as president, he had run-ins continuously with Joseph Stalin's replacement. Stalin had died in 1954, and Nikita Khrushchev, a World War II general and hero of the Soviet Union, rose to take his place as the premier of the Soviet Union. At the Summit Conference #1, the United States proposed complete disarmament between the USA and the USSR. This was countered by Khrushchev, who basically dismissed this as a fool's errand, and because of the complete and total distrust between the two leaders, instead of limiting the amount of arms in the arms race, it actually made the arms race accelerate. And this was alarming to many people because both nations had achieved by that point nuclear capabilities. This is when a lot of people started to think about building bomb shelters, and they started watching educational films such as Duck and Cover. And I encourage you to all look up Duck and Cover on the YouTube. YouTube. Look at it. I sound like a very old person when I say the YouTube. But looking up on YouTube, if you look up Duck and Cover, this was an actual film that was shown to students your age about what to do in the event of a nuclear attack. It, of course, was a complete and total fantasy that anything they said to do would actually protect you, but people were in a state of panic at that point when it came to nuclear ambition. Now, the Camp David meeting was a meeting at the presidential retreat known as Camp David in the Maryland foothills, and basically there was this push at this point to evacuate Berlin, that maybe, Khrushchev was going to strike hard and strike fast at Berlin. Maybe we should evacuate, maybe we should do something different. All in all, it was just a showdown as to who was going to blink first. And at the Summit Conference #2, we were on the basically heels of the U-2 incident. This was a spy plane that was shot down over the Soviet Union containing Francis Gary Powers. The pilot was held. It was a huge PR disaster for the United States, as one of our soldiers, one of our airmen, basically had been captured by the Soviets and pretty obviously captured on a mission to spy on the Soviets and their military capabilities and whatever else. And this came to a head when Fidel Castro took over Cuba in the Cuban Revolution in 1958. Fidel Castro immediately, upon taking over and overthrowing the government that was basically sponsored by the United States ever since the Spanish-American War, when he overthrew that government, he immediately turned his attentions to becoming closer partners and allies with the Soviet Union. This prompted the United States to start an embargo against Cuba that continues all the way up until this day. That is why you cannot fly to Cuba directly. You can look up flights to Havana all you want, but you will not leave from an American airport and get a direct flight there. And even if you do go to Havana, you're going to answer a ton of questions coming back through whatever country, whether it be Canada or Mexico, that you fly through to get home. Cuba is still considered public enemy number one in the Western Hemisphere, and it's all because of Fidel Castro's overthrow of the government. Even though Fidel Castro has been dead and has not been in power for a number of years, it still doesn't matter. We still have that embargo against Cuba, which we thought would be absolutely crippling to their economy, but they've managed to persevere without our help. Bottom line is, that Cuban Revolution was the first time that the Soviets seemingly had a foothold into our Western Hemisphere, and it certainly violates the containment policy that Truman and Eisenhower had been following. Of course, it's not until the presidency of JFK that we seemingly are going to do something about it. And as we will learn, one of the things we do works, and the other one is a complete and total disaster. Of course, speaking of John F. Kennedy comes to power after the election of 1960, which pitted Republican and former Vice President Richard Nixon against this young upstart, Kennedy, from Massachusetts. Richard Nixon had been the vice president under Eisenhower for 8 years. He had been a consummate government servant. He had served in World War II. But the American people chose John F. Kennedy instead. Now, John F. Kennedy was a one-term senator from Massachusetts who came from a very wealthy family. He had been a war hero, and it had been amplified by his Profiles in Courage, which was a autobiography about his time in service during the Pacific War. This made him a household name, and the Democrats nominated him at their convention in 1960 to go against the vice president. Now, of course, some of the issues that JFK was going to have to conquer was the fact that he was young. The youngest president we had ever had was 42, and that was Teddy Roosevelt, but he had only taken the presidency because of the death of the previous president. Kennedy was 43 years old and was seen as way too young and way too inexperienced by many voters. It also didn't help that he was a Catholic. Every single president we had had, 1 through 34, had been a Protestant. Of course, the most prevalent was Episcopalian, which is just fun to say. Kennedy, however, came in with a Catholic faith that made some people believe that he couldn't possibly go against the Pope, which, because of that mentality, hurt his chances as a candidate. The only candidate we had had with that issue was Al Smith in 1928, and Al Smith lost in that election to Herbert Hoover. Many people believed it was because of his Catholic faith, and they thought that Kennedy might suffer the same fate. Of course, television intervenes. There were 4 debates between these two candidates, but the differences became very clear that television was having an impact. Why? When the debates were aired, Kennedy looked younger. Kennedy looked composed on camera. He looked tanner, even in a black and white television. He just looked younger, more vibrant, if you will. It didn't help that Nixon, when the debate was televised, had a sinus infection and was sweating because of the bad lights. He had chosen to wear a lot of makeup, which started to melt under those hot lights. What it basically came down to in 1960 is the men voted for Richard Nixon. The women, by an overwhelming majority and for the first time, parted ways with their husband because, let's be honest, if you could look at Kennedy for 4 years or Nixon for 4 years, Kennedy was the man. And because of the advent of television as a political tool, Kennedy wins the presidency very narrowly, and he dominated the cities, which means Kennedy also dominated the minority vote as well, setting the stage for the modern Democratic mantra of going after minority and female votes. No president has ever won without courting large numbers of those demographics in the Democratic Party. Just like the Republicans need to win Ohio, the Democrats need to win the minority vote. And of course, looking at the Electoral College map of 1960, it goes to show you just how important it was for Kennedy to win the cities and the minority vote. Kennedy sweeps, for the most part, the South, and of course the Eastern Seaboard with the largest cities, Boston, New York City, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia. Bottom line is, Kennedy ran a smart campaign, and he needed to, because it was a razor-thin margin between Nixon and Kennedy. And this is the kind of stuff that would keep Nixon up at night. The fact that only a few votes would have swayed the election towards him. Kennedy manages to win, and by winning becomes the youngest president and our 35th president. John F. Kennedy, taking the oath of office and becoming that 35th president, ushered in what was known as the New Frontier for America. Now, Kennedy had espoused this New Frontier mentality all throughout the 1960 campaign, and it paid off because there was a considerable youth movement in his campaign. He did manage to not only be the youngest president ever elected, but also have the youngest cabinet. One of the major people on his cabinet was his Attorney General pick, Robert F. Kennedy, his brother. This was a very controversial thing to do, as Robert was even younger than John F. Kennedy. But Kennedy basically went against these charges of nepotism in arguing that Robert was his most trusted advisor and would be a great attorney general. Now, of course, there are people on both sides of that argument, and many historians have debated just how solid he was, but RFK definitely became his right-hand man all the way through his term. Kennedy's appeal, obviously, was not just his youth, but his speaking ability, his comfortability on camera, and the fact that he seemingly understood the problems with which he faced, even when he probably didn't. His speeches, such as "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country," inspired people at a time when fear seemingly reigned over the American Republic. With his youthful exuberance and his calls to action, it caused young people to get more involved. One of the proposals that he forms is the Peace Corps. The idea here that instead of joining the military to go out and see the world, young people could join forces with others to bring peace and understanding. In reality, what it did is it allowed young people to go abroad to third world nations to help others and to spread democratic values and American principles to other countries that may not have them. It was a way of getting the third world to deny communism and adopt more, shall we say, capitalist or democratic ideals. Of course, he had the problems of the economy to deal with as well, and limiting inflation became a rule of the day. As the 1950s economy started to motor on, the things that also seemingly were happening were prices were rising too, and the standard of living was really flagging for those at the bottom. Kennedy tried his best in his limited time as president to limit the amount of inflation as much as possible through some of his Federal Reserve bolstering programs. Now, at the same time, he also was an ambitious man as well. He said he was going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Now, Kennedy would not be president at the end of the decade, even if he won a second term. He would have left office in 1968, 69 technically. So he would not be the president regardless. Little did he know, of course, that his term of office would end quite abruptly, but his statement that he would put a man on the moon by the time the decade was out was exceptionally ambitious because we had not even put a man in space at that point. We were lagging far behind the Russians, but his rhetoric and his push for NASA and space exploration was going to have far-reaching impacts throughout the decade and beyond. As much as Kennedy would love to focus on domestic issues and handle the economy, it was outside issues that dominated his term. Foreign issues were the major source of concern from the time of Eisenhower and even really Truman for that matter. As soon as we descended into the Cold War, Berlin was going to be an issue. What to do about Berlin? Of course, Stalin had tried to starve them out in the blockade, but our airlift had shamed the Soviets into capitulating and allowing for Berlin to still exist. And when I say Berlin, we're talking about West Berlin. Now, of course, in 1961, Khrushchev decided that he was going to test this young whippersnapper and see what the response would be from somebody that was not a general during World War II. And so they built the Berlin Wall. This was, of course, a wall to wall in the capitalists of West Berlin. This separated families, this separated businesses, this separated, not just the city, but people. And this was a wall that was guarded by armed guards and, had barbed wire and machine gun nests and you name it. And Berlin basically became a walled city at that point. Now, of course, Kennedy's response to this could be all-out war, but he chose instead to try and shame the Soviets. So he flew to West Berlin and gave a speech. In that speech, he told the Berliners very famously, "Ich bin ein Berliner." Now, most Berliners knew what he meant. He was trying to say, "I'm a Berliner too," which was his way of saying, "We have not forgotten you. You may be walled off, but you have not been forgotten." In reality, what he said is, "I am a jelly donut." This is where you really do need proofreaders and better people to translate your speeches before you give them. Either way, the Berliners took heart from this, and Kennedy showed a master class of diplomacy by avoiding an armed conflict, yet still bolstering the reserve of the Germans. Now, the Atlantic community also had a kind of upstart from the France called Charles de Gaulle. Charles de Gaulle during World War II had been the resistance leader, if you will. He had risen to be the leader of France, and he also wanted to challenge Kennedy for supremacy, if you will, on the world stage and diplomacy. Now, of course, de Gaulle, by pushing Kennedy, was really not helping the resolve of the Allies. Kennedy managed to outmaneuver de Gaulle in many cases, and certainly used the United Nations to do so. Kennedy, of course, had to also deal with issues that were happening in South Asia, Laos, Vietnam. These were areas that France had basically given up on as colonies in the early 1950s. And it was mostly because of the armed resistance by the followers of a man named Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh had basically taken Vietnam and put it into a communist revolution. The United States needed to figure out what they wanted to do to prevent the spread of communism to yet another Southeast Asian country. And his mentality was a flexible response, that instead of using conventional military forces, we would use special forces instead and military advisors, which had already really been instigated and imposed by Eisenhower during the 50s. Kennedy continued that and escalated the struggle from there. It was only a matter of time before Vietnam was going to become a household name problem and culminate in what eventually would be the Vietnam War. Now, what really came to define JFK's presidency was the Cuban issue. What to do about Fidel Castro? Castro, of course, had risen to power in '58, and by '61 he was becoming a royal pain in the United States rear end. The simple fact that Cuba was only 90 miles off of the coast of Florida didn't help. So, of course, when the CIA cooked up a scheme in 1961 to remove Castro and to utilize foreign nationals who had landed in Florida to bolster this and basically turn it into a Cuban Civil War again, funded and trained by the United States military. JFK unwisely signed off on this plan by the CIA to overthrow Castro. What ended up happening is instead of the Cuban nationals landing in the Bay of Pigs, which was on the southern coast of Cuba, instead of landing there and successfully marching on Havana, Castro had already caught wind of this and dispatched his own military to greet them on the beaches. When that, of course, happens, the Cuban nationals were cut down and either massacred or forced to surrender to the Cuban military. Now, this was a huge black eye on this young president's first year in office, and JFK had to accept the blame for a really horrifically bad plan of action. Now, this emboldened Khrushchev in October of 1961 to plant nuclear weapons in Cuba. This, again, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, allowed for the Soviets to have the same air capability that the United States had had over the Soviet Union when we took over bases in Greece and Turkey under the Truman Doctrine. Bottom line is, the United States had a decision to make. We could either bomb the heck out of Cuba and try and take care of Castro and the Soviets at the same time, while still risking the fact that they had nuclear warheads there and could fire them off at any point, or we could do a diplomatic approach. Khrushchev basically said, you need to remove the missiles that are currently threatening me, and I'll remove the missiles that are threatening you. Kennedy instead sent down the United States Navy to surround Cuba in a blockade. This did not allow for any military or social aid to be distributed from the Soviet Union to the Cuban people, which was desperately necessary for Castro, because Castro was still trying to solidify power as the new leader of Cuba. Khrushchev ended up being disgraced by this on the international community. And over the course of 13 days, he finally capitulated to JFK's demands, which allowed JFK to look strong and certainly went against any of the goals that Khrushchev had set out for this. What this eventually does is prove that we need to talk things out a little bit better before we come literally a button push away from nuclear war. And so a Moscow to Washington hotline was established that allowed the two world leaders to talk directly. And from the time of Kennedy all the way up through Reagan and Gorbachev, this hotline existed specifically to handle the issues of the Cold War. Of course, Kennedy's crowning achievement during the Cuban Missile Crisis, after 13 days of uncertainty and fear, culminating in U.S. victory, was completely and totally crushed in November of 1963, when on November 22nd, John F. Kennedy went to Dallas, Texas to kick off his re-election campaign for 1964. In going to Dallas, Texas, he was going to wave to crowds and attempt to court the Texas crowds in a celebration of his first 3 years in the presidency. By going to Dallas, Texas, he got into the open-air convertible with his wife, Jackie Kennedy, in the back seat, and the governor of Texas in the front seat. As they drove through Dallas, Texas, Lee Harvey Oswald shot and killed John F. Kennedy from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building along the parade route. Now, of course, every single conspiracy theory that ever came in to existence from this can be found on the internet, and there are, of course, a number of people that have said Lee Harvey Oswald could have never acted alone. You will hear the conspiracy theories about there was definitely a second gunner on the grassy knoll. You will hear conspiracy theories that LBJ, his vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was involved, or the mob was involved, or the Soviets were involved, or whatever. If you ever go to Dallas, Texas, you really should go to the 6th floor museum, which is the old Texas School Book Depository building, where you will not only see where Lee Harvey Oswald shot from, supposedly, but you will also see a huge wall of conspiracy theories that will kind of give you an idea of who was involved in each one of them and in what capacity and how so. It's really quite a sight to see, all out of conspiracy theories. Now, the Warren Commission, which formed around Earl Warren, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, investigated and came to the conclusion that Oswald acted alone. And that has been the official United States government stance about this assassination ever since the commission handed down their results. But of course, if you read on the internet, there are plenty of people that dispute it. Either way, Lyndon Baines Johnson became President of the United States. He swore in on Air Force One on the way back to Washington, D.C., with Jackie Kennedy standing right next to him. There's an iconic photo of that as well. Jackie's still standing in the dress that she was wearing when her husband was shot next to her, covered in his blood. Now, of course, this was a shock. And I mentioned before, there are dates in every generation that people remember where they were. My grandparents' generation was Pearl Harbor. My generation will be 9/11. And of course, my parents' generation was this shooting. My parents remember distinctly where they were, what classroom they were in, who came over the loudspeaker to tell them. All of it. They remember step by step. So maybe some of you have grandparents that would remember where they were on November 22nd, 1963. And I would argue this is a turning point in American history because there were, like I said before, JFK coming to the presidency, there was a large youth movement in this. There were people that had never really been involved in politics who now were absolutely involved in politics because of JFK. And this very idealistic mentality, this young man, this young president with a young family, with him being gunned down, it was almost like the innocence of youth was being gunned down along with it. And so the 1960s would become more turbulent, and it would become an era of youth uprising, youth revolt, of course, hippies and drug culture, and all the stormy 60s type mentality you hear about all comes, in my mind, because of the new, I guess, shall we say, maturity of the United States, that we're not living in this dream world anymore. We're not living in literally what they called Camelot, which was a play, a musical on Broadway at the time about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Well, they called Kennedy's White House Camelot because it was just such an idyllic situation. And of course, when the nation goes into mourning on JFK's assassination, even at the funeral, and my mother still vividly remembers this, watching the funeral procession, seeing Jackie as you see her there with the two brothers, Robert to the right there and Ted Kennedy over to the left there, standing behind her, and her two children, Caroline and John Jr., standing waiting for their father's casket to pass by, and John Jr. saluting the casket as his father is wheeled past. My mother still cries when she sees this footage of the funeral. And weirdly enough, the Kennedy curse starts with this. Robert F. Kennedy will also be assassinated in 1968. Ted Kennedy will have a boatload of issues during his life. And then John Jr. will also die in a plane crash a few decades ago, along with his young wife and his very young son, just off the coast of Martha's Vineyard. So if you ever want to see something weird, look up the Kennedy curse. So this raises the question, and we finally come to the end here. Where does the United States go from here? We've lost a leader in John F. Kennedy who was young and idealistic, and replaced him with a Southern old man in LBJ. Who are we as a nation? We've gone from a decade that saw economic growth and prosperity under Eisenhower that still had its problems because of fear and because of McCarthyism. Is that really who we are? Are we living up to our founding principles? We try and desegregate some things, and the South rises up in fury. Is that enough to just desegregate the military? Is it enough to just desegregate the bus service? Is it enough to just desegregate the public schools in Brown versus the Board of Education, which we'll talk about when we talk about the civil rights movement of the 1960s? And of course, who are the next leaders? Who's going to step up? And of course, everybody at this time period is looking for the next leader. If JFK was the next generation, we're putting in the past, at least we think, leaders like Eisenhower, leaders like Truman. Those are yesterday's news. Who's going to step up? You'll notice that one of the reasons that this becomes a backlash decade and such a weird decade is the emergence of the Richard Nixon presidency in 1968, which we will get to. People that they thought were going away seemingly were coming back. And a lot of young people really hated the fact that their parents' generation was still running the show. Some of you should feel somewhat tied to that from your own mentality, that older people don't quite get it, and they don't understand, and they don't see the problems. So the 60s are very much still alive, at least in mentality, when it comes to youth versus old age.